Get ready to rock radio.
I'm determined, I think, to at least start a project this year. The last record that I put out, I think it was about 4 years between Liars and Arena, 3 or 4 years, and that's probably the outside. That's probably as long as I should take. I should probably get music created a little quicker than that. And part of the slowdown is due to me just, after you've written so much music, it takes you a little while to get around to something that seems like a new and interesting tack on everything. So I already have that part of it. I think it didn't take me as long to decide what I wanted to write about and the form that I want to write in. But I don't expect to get more than just started on it this year. I don't expect that I'll finish anything this year. But part of my grand plan is just to keep the hellhounds off my trail and keep working. And, as a musician, is a hard enough thing, in healthy times. And so these economic times, you've got to work a little bit harder, go a little bit further, and I plan on continuing.
I mean, this time of the year, we're talking now in January, and the start of a new decade, and I know we tend to be reflective on what's gone on in the past and looking forward to the future. You've mentioned just briefly about trying to get into a new album project this year if you can. Now, looking back, Todd, over the last decade, what would you say have been the highlights for you in musical terms, and perhaps even personally? What have been the achievements for you? What worked well, and the usual thing, what didn't perhaps work so well for you?
From a decade standpoint, it hasn't been such a bad decade. The high point, I suppose, was the new found attention that the Liars album brought to me, which was pretty much unexpected. I figured that I would be going through this normal sort of period of artistic doldrums that almost any artist who lasts long enough is going to have to go through. It's like, let's say the 60s, 70s, and 80s for Tony Bennett. He became, the kind of style of music. He was popular when the style of music that he performed was popular in like the 50s and into the early 60s. Then that music was not, the kids didn't listen to that music anymore. And so you didn't hear much about Tony Bennett. He just soldiered on doing whatever he did. Then years and years later, when that style of music when people started to get interested in that again, through other artists like Michael Bublé or the rediscovering of Sinatra by a lounge-conscious youth, and things like that, When Frank Sinatra got rediscovered, so did Tony Bennett, and now Tony Bennett has a healthy career again. And so I figured that's kind of like the arc of what my life would be like. I'd have to find other things to do or just constantly tour under the radar in order to survive as a musician until suddenly people rediscover the 70s and my price tag suddenly shoots through the roof. It happened a little bit earlier than that, and it wasn't a product of any sort of musical nostalgia. I decided that I wanted to do a record that was based around a concept in the way that I used to make records. Almost all of my records would have some overarching concept. And as it turned out, it hit a resonant chord with some significant part of the critical world. And that, even though I've been putting out records for years and years, nobody was even reviewing them. And then suddenly I'm getting all of this additional kind of attention in a good way. That brought the opportunity, to do a more elaborate production, something a little bit more memorable for the fans than just going out and playing the music. And the whole Liars tour, I guess, fired up a new audience in a way. And that's also given me the opportunity to tour a little bit more. At the same time, I've had my disappointment. There was the fact that I couldn't actually literally afford to continue to tour behind Liars because, it was a band and a production, and it's the kind of thing that, once the ticket price drops below a certain threshold, you really can't afford to do it anymore. And that's what eventually happened. And I went back to doing solo shows and and actually toured more of England than I had in recent years, but as a double bill with Joe Jackson. And what I discovered during the course of that was that the solo show that I had kept in my back pocket had grown completely stale and obsolete. So I couldn't do that anymore. Most of it was a product of the fact that I wasn't continuing to write the kind of material that worked for me to, worked in a solo context. Everything, the production levels were all a little bit bigger, and none of it sounded right when I would attempt to play it on just one guitar or one piano. So I'd essentially written myself out of the solo shows.
And they'd worked so well in the States, hadn't they? Previously. I remember you telling me that several years ago, actually, that, yes, you might have been a bit under the radar in a lot of people's minds, but you were doing these solo shows, weren't you?
Well, see, that's, and eventually, if, depending on what happens with, the market and my personal value in it, that's what you go back to. You just scale back down again. Fortunately, I've got enough of an audience, and depending on the kind of show that I'm doing, there's enough of a residual audience that if the venues become small and the ticket prices become high, I can still sell those. And then, in the case of a Wizard or True Star, well, I guess the ticket price is high for that because it's an event. But for more conventional touring, you want to play larger places for, maybe a little less extravagant ticket price. So I'm prepared to do that as well. The music business being the shambles it is, you have to go back to what musicians have always done, which is, get into your troubadour outfit and go out with your hat in hand,
yes,
and just play anywhere that anyone will listen.
Get ready to rock radio.
Because, of course, we saw you several years ago. You mentioned the Joe Jackson double bill thing. And I think we spoke just before that tour, but I'm not so sure whether that worked in the sense, I think I probably told you that at the time, that, obviously there was a good body of people in the audience, in fact probably most of them, to be truthful, Todd, who came to see you. And you always feel a bit frustrated because obviously it was a joint bill, wasn't it? So you don't get the full set, really.
Well, there is a certain challenge in those kinds of shows, and we didn't necessarily we didn't sit down and say, okay, what would be the ideal double bill, and put together a tour based around that. There was certainly mutual admiration, and that made it interesting for both Joe and I to do in the first place.
Yes.
But in terms of our, whether there was any
sort of crossover, really, isn't it?
Congruence in our audience. That was a completely different question. We undertook the tour actually based on the response to a single show that we did in New York, the New York Shakespeare Festival, also known as the Public Theater. I did a revival of a musical I had written for them, and Joe was kind and brave enough to take on one of the roles in this one night revival. So he came in and learned a bunch of stuff and sang it great, and it was a big plus to the whole show. And we were approached after that by the people who had promoted that particular revival about doing just doing one show in a venue called the Delacorte Theater, which is an open-air theater in Central Park where they usually do Shakespeare during the summer. But they had a concert series that was whenever there wasn't a Shakespeare production, they would put concerts on in the theater, and they said, why don't we do one of these later this summer, and we'll add a string quartet, one of these modern string quartets called Ethel, who would essentially be the opening act, and then it would be me and Joe at the double bill. And the show sold out really quickly because New York is a big enough city that both Joe and I have significant audiences there. And I think that also, our core audiences, both of our core audiences, are somewhat musically sophisticated and interested in that kind of stuff. And the show went out and was great. It was like a huge critical success. It was the most successful show they'd had all summer. And so immediately everyone started talking about doing a tour with me and Joe and the string quartet, and that's eventually what we did. But as you point out, as we travel around the world, there was the huge diversity, of audience commitment. Whereas we would go some places, and yes, a significant portion of the audience might be there to see me and be less responsive or whatever potentially to Joe. But then we would go other places, like when we played in Germany, which I rarely get to, and everyone was there to see Joe, and nobody was there to see me, and they would sit extremely quietly and politely.
Yeah, I know. Yeah,
for Joe. So in the end, it was, we did have on occasions, and probably more often here in the States than we did in Europe, nights when everything was when everything was firing.
Yeah.
The audience, Joe was winning my people over, and I was winning Joe's people over, and and that was great. But that didn't happen dependably enough, I think, for us to continue doing a show like that.
Yes.
Also, I think that Joe and I both, we do this as a novelty thing, but neither of us enjoys the kind of musical responsibility that's involved when you have to hold everybody's attention completely yourself. And that for both of us, it's much more fun to play with a band and to interact off of other musicians as well.
Yeah.
As, interacting with the audience.
Because I think actually you'd spoiled us really, because you'd already been here with the Liars tour, which was great. Really, it was a great, it's a great album, and it was a great show. And more recently, we talked. The last time we talked, it was just before the Arena tour in the UK. I mean, that really, it's fantastic because I did, secretly, it's very difficult when you're speaking to someone like yourself and, ahead of a tour, and obviously you want to do the best for that tour, but I always felt deep down that I just want to hear Todd play some guitar. And I think other people did, because you got that feedback, I think, when you were touring the States. You were telling me, obviously...
The whole Arena thing was an opportunity to
yes.
do that, and I think I was conscious before I made that record that I was, wanted to recover some of that comfort level. When I was doing the solo shows, I was simply a strummer,
Oh, yeah.
Just scrubbing away, and what happened was in the interim, as I toured with I was touring with the Tony Levin band as a quartet, and that kind of brought me back to playing more guitar live. So after doing that for a while, I came to the conclusion that I really wanted to start writing more guitar-oriented music and doing a little more guitar playing in the next project that I got to, and eventually that was Arena.
Get ready to rock radio.
Do you think you'll go on in this vein? I mean, I know you're someone who surprises us all, really, and you can never pigeonhole Todd Rundgren, but, I mean, it seemed to me a great development, and I always wondered whether perhaps, with everything going on, the songwriting and producing, that maybe you've subjugated your guitar playing over the years, and maybe this was a bit of a discovery, a personal discovery, really.
In a way, I'm sort of moving backwards now.
Oh, no, that's good. That's good.
my guitar thing, because part of the deal that I made for the distribution of Arena involved me recording an album of Robert Johnson songs. The distributor the entity that we made the distribution deal with for Arena also happened to be administering Robert Johnson's catalog, and they wanted to, which is a kind of a smart move in today's scary record environment, and that they try and exploit more than simply the record. So the idea was to have versions of Robert Johnson songs, not just a record in which Robert Johnson publishing would be collected, but also versions of the songs that could be potentially used for licensing, because they apparently were getting a lot of requests for versions of Robert Johnson songs which they didn't have. Only these sort of the originals or ones that other artists had recorded, and they could not get licenses to. So when we did the initial Wizard shows starting in Akron and going through the Midwest and stuff like that, the opening act was a variation of Utopia. We called it Notopia because it technically was not Utopia, but since Roger Powell was in the band and Chasm was in the band and I was in the band, we just simply got Prairie, the drummer, to learn 10 Utopia songs, and then we were our own opening act for the tour. And that was something that was pretty thrilling for a lot of the audience, because many of them came to the music after Utopia had kind of like finished touring.
Yeah.
So it was an opportunity for them to get not really a Utopia show, but some sort of a little taste of it. In any case, Roger has gone back to his previous gig, which doesn't involve touring. And he essentially, it was great that he could make it out, but he can't get constant leave of absence from his regular job to go out and play anytime he wants. So we did a few more shows, another 4 shows in California, and for that we contacted Ralph Schuckett, who was actually in the original Utopia and actually played on A Wizard of True Star.
Yes.
But we weren't going to do the Utopia thing anymore, so instead we opened the show with a set of Robert Johnson songs. So that's how we'll be opening the show when we get to London. We don't talk so much about the opening act. It's not really what we're featuring, and we don't want to distract people from the meat of the show, which is the theatricalization of the Wizard album.
Yes. Now let's talk a bit more about that. This is happening in February in London, and it's the album that was first released in 1973, and it was, of its time, it was trailblazing in terms of blending sort of progressive pop rock influences, and all these elements have actually come into your music subsequently, that they're always there in some form, even on the recent albums. Now, what, Todd, then were the motivations to actually perform this album again? This particular album?
It actually, came out of England. When we were, I guess it's about a year and some months ago, I guess we were there in November of 2008. And I was having dinner with our British promoter, and he came up with the suggestion based on the fact that there was a cadre of younger artists, mostly sort of synthesizer artists, mixologists, electronica, and that sort of thing, who had discovered the record and were actually citing it and going so far as to sample it and put it in their own records. A band called Hot Chip used a big sample from one of the records and had a YouTube video that featured it, stuff like that. So he thought it would be a great way to introduce a younger audience to me as an artist by doing a showcase of that record. He could tie it into a movement in music that was contemporary. And we talked about what kind of form it might take and when we might do it, and then word of that got back to the U.S. and a bunch of U.S. fans decided that they didn't want to have to go to England to see this, and so they actually promoted the shows themselves. And most of the shows that we've done of the Wizard album have been promoted not by regular concert promoters, but by kind of an inside group of fans who've taken on that responsibility. So it really came about in a kind of organic manner, and once the bottom line criteria were met, once the cost of mounting it could be defrayed, and once all of the other aspects of the promotion of the shows were secured, then I didn't have an excuse for not doing it. I had to devise a way to pull it off, and from that point on, then I came up with essentially the theatricalization scheme and all the other aspects.
Get ready to rock radio.
Am I right in saying it wasn't really a concept album?
It was essentially an anti-concept album. The idea was that people had not rethought the actual form factor, or most musicians and most artists had not rethought what was possible when music started moving from, first of all, 78s to 45s, and then 45s to LPs, and then eventually, of course, years later, to CDs. But each one of these was an increase in the amount of programming that could be fit on a commensurately sized piece of plastic. And most artists, myself included, even though I, didn't have like a long history of singles and things like that, most artists were recording 3-minute songs and collecting a dozen of those together to make an album. And the songs were 3 minutes because that's how big a 45 was. A lot of people don't put two and two together, but why are songs all 3 minutes long? Well, it may have something to do with human psychology, but it also may have to do with the fact that that's kind of the optimal amount of music that a 45 RPM record would hold. And then when everything moved to the LP, the so-called long player, well, classical music took advantage of it, but pop music continued to go on in 3-minute chunks. And it was some time around, it was a true star that, I was trying to, first of all, individualize myself as an artist. I was being compared to other artists too much, and I didn't like that. I didn't want to be simply, well, if we can't get Carole King, we'll get this guy. I wanted to be irreplaceable. So I started looking for, different avenues, musical avenues to explore. Part of that whole thing was the realization that for most pop musicians, and with a few exceptions, they weren't looking at the LP in terms of what, kind of potential it had. They were still thinking in 3-minute chunks. And progressive rock was just starting to happen, and so songs were getting longer. But I figured, why pay attention at all to the length of the music? Just make the music until another idea comes along, and then just completely left turn into that. It doesn't have to have any sort of real continuity to it. Just capture as much sound as you can, and just figure out some sort of flow or order to put it in, that conveys a sort of an energy, not necessarily specific ideas, but a whole sort of a way of hearing things, and a kind of like a completely free and loose, style neutral way of looking at what kind of music could go on the record, and whether it had to be music at all, whether it could just be sounds. So every once in a while the record laps into soundscapes that don't necessarily have a musical structure to them, and then put it out to the dismay of a lot of people.
Now I was going to ask you, what was the reaction of the record label then when you delivered that album, Todd?
Well, it's funny. There were two distinct reactions. On the one hand, there was the staff that had to actually do the work of a record label and call up radio stations to try and convince them to play songs and things like that, and it's the business of selling records essentially. And the problem was that I had it wasn't so much that I had confounded that as that the previous record, Something Anything, had opened so many doors and created so many opportunities, presumably for me, but also for the people at the label, because it made it so much easier for them to go to the radio and say, hey, we got a new Todd Rundgren record, this will be like hit record number 4 or something. Instead, I gave them a record with no singles on it at all and nothing they could take to radio to sell. And so they were completely flummoxed and disconcerted. The critical response was, what the fuck? This guy has taken too many drugs, completely. The next thing you know, it's going to be Sid Barrett, and he'll be in the hospital somewhere. At the same time, the package wouldn't have been what it was without the encouragement of Albert Grossman, who, while it essentially was his label, he formed the label, and it was supposedly his vision behind the label. He didn't do the day-to-day work. He looked at it as a place. If he found an artist that he liked, it was a place to get their records released. He wouldn't have to go to some other label. He could release them himself. And he was amused by the whole thing. He had lived through Dylan's transition from acoustic to electric artist, and the whole furor that went with that. And I think he enjoyed that. And so he was sort of enjoying the fact that I had, upset the apple cart in some sort of musical way by releasing this record. And so he was the one that actually encouraged the die cut, the package. I would have liked to have had that done, but couldn't insist on it. But he went for it. He went for the things that were stuffed in the sleeve, like the little poem by Patti Smith and the postcard that people sent back, which was kind of a brilliant idea because it was a way of building a mailing list. And so that was his idea. I never had those sort of marketing-oriented ideas. And so he actually sort of encouraged it. And the record didn't really, there was some follow-up sales, but it didn't sell anything like Something Anything did at the time. But it was a record for a certain audience. A certain audience really fell for it. And that, the word of mouth of that, and also the fact that a significant portion of that audience either was or would be musicians themselves, kind of created this, soft spot for the record that lasted forever. And the time period and what happened when the record came out created this distinct schism in my audience, that there were people who kind of stopped listening after Something Anything, and if they see my name and show up at a show, they expect me to do everything from Something Anything.
Yeah, I can see that.
Mistakenly, but and usually they never buy another concert ticket after that. And then there are the ones who kind of survived the transition or came on board after A Wizard of True Stars, and for them, that's the beginning of my career.
Get ready to rock radio.
It's like the beginning of, I think I'm right in saying, Utopia, isn't it? Because it featured some of the musicians, and of course, you stretched the progressive elements, didn't you, really, with Utopia? So that would have given you a whole new audience.
Yeah, also you could say the birth of Utopia.
Yeah.
Made something of a commitment to so-called progressive music. And it was kind of the milieu as well at the time. It was a strange record for me, but people forget that, while on one hand there were the highly successful singer-songwriters, music was becoming more of a personal thing, because a lot of it up until the Beatles, there were songwriters singers. Songwriters were usually unattractive people. So they would find somebody attractive to, sing their material. But, the expectations changed after the Beatles. After that, everyone was expected to write their own material. And things went, a couple of different ways in that regard. In one regard, people continued to write pop songs and became pop stylists and pop craftsmen, but they wrote the songs themselves. It was Carole King and James Taylor and Elton John and all of these, a whole, kind of class of highly successful singer-songwriters. Then there was the whole progressive rock movement, which involved, bands like Genesis and Yes and Emerson, Lake and Palmer, and ultimately Mahavishnu Orchestra and Return to Forever, and the whole what they called fusion movement. And Utopia, the initial versions of it were born in that cauldron. And essentially, what I was ultimately trying to accomplish, I guess, was a more clear division of styles in my own music. In other words, all of my progressive rock leanings I would expend on Utopia, and all of my singer-songwriter leanings I would expend on my own records. And by the time I got to an album like Hermit of Make Hollow, then we've got a nice, concise album of pop-ish songs paired up with, I guess, around that period would be Ra, or some of the, some of the earlier and very progressive Utopia records. And I hope that would, that would give the audience a more clear choice, and so they could say, okay, I like the progressive aspects, and and the guitar noodling and stuff like that. Buy Utopia records for that. But I also like the the personal Todd Rundgren, emotional, insightful, whatever it is, thing that people like about my more personal songwriting, and then they could buy my solo records for that. And then I went to hell anyway. Utopia started writing pop songs.
Oh yeah, but I think what's happened also, coming back to the last decade, I think this is where it is quite exciting in the sense that I think you probably have got out to a new audience with the latest albums. And I think these the last studio albums, I'm talking Liars and Arena, they obviously encompass a lot of these earlier influences anyway. And I would presume now, Todd, you don't feel any need to go any different direction because it's all there in place, isn't it, really, for people to discover? And you're continuing to have those influences go on, really, in the current albums,
Well, there certainly is enough there that if you've never heard any of it before, it'll take you a good long time to get through it. And ideally you are forewarned that it's going to cover, a lot of the map. It's not that I'm without musical horizons to explore, but I think some of them are maybe old ideas that I never got to exploit. I did get to write a musical for the Public Theater, and that was something that I'd always wanted to do, and thought that would become a significant part of my work. Unfortunately, Joseph Papp, who was sort of my mentor there, got cancer and died, and then the whole agenda changed a little bit. But after I had written a musical for them, he wanted me to continue to write for the Public Theater and wanted me to write an opera for them, and never got around to that. So somewhere out there's the opera.
There's the Todd Rundgren opera, yeah. Because you mentioned just going back to the stage production for A Wizard, A True Star, you mentioned something about you've had to visualize it and make it theatrical, I think you were saying, really. So we can expect full stage show with, whatever concepts you've brought to this piece. It's going to be quite a spectacle.
It's still, of course, limited by whatever our budget. This is not charity. In other words, we don't have the unicycle troupe, or the trained monkeys. 12 costume changes in an hour.
Oh, right, yeah.
Part of it, it's when you're devising a show like this, a lot of kind of logistical factors that you have to take into consideration, like the show has to be moved in and set up in less than a day. It can't take a week to put the show on, so some things, have to be, some things you might like to do, you have to kind of perhaps put aside. We'd love to have, the big industrial-sized lasers, but those require extensive permitting process and extra personnel, like licensed operators, for what essentially is an effect you use once or twice during the show. And if we were U2, we wouldn't blink an eye. It's U2, they take a small city, for a show. So adding one person to manage strobe lights is not a big deal for them. So I discovered that the biggest bang for the buck is, in this particular instance, the costume changes and the way that they theatricalize each of the musical bits. In other words, we're not just standing there playing the record. I am a character for each song. There's a historical aspect to it, and in that, even though I don't have the body that I had in 1973, we're still trying to put some of those costumes on it, because so many people, who have an interest in this record never saw it performed. While we performed parts of it, we never performed the whole thing. We're doing it now. So in a way, it's, I think, the expectation is that this is more than simply an exhibition. This is intended to be a transportive experience. Back to a time when, when the approach to, a musical show was inherently more theatrical.
As ever, Todd, it's been really fantastic talking to you. I mean, we've covered a lot of ground in a lot more time than I expected, really, so we're grateful for that. And
no problem. Like I say, once I get going.
Yeah. And best of luck for the show in London in February.
Terrific. We'll see you there.